first speaker is Duncan. We're happy to have him here. He has no achievements that he wants to mention. I'm sure there are many. The title of his speech is Refuting a Conspiracy. It is speech number 5 in the CC manual. It is 5 to 7 minutes. Please help me welcome Dave Duncan.
I recently received an email from a friend. It contained a link to a video that proved that the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center did not collapse because of the plane crashes and the ensuing fires. Instead, it claimed that the collapses were due to building demolition explosives. The video made several points in coming to its conclusion that there was no other explanation. I'd like to address a few of these points and question whether there really was no other explanation other than the building being blown up. Before I start with the video rebuttal though, let me first make a few disclaimers. First, I'm not a fan of either the Bush or the Obama administrations. I think that both administrations have seized upon the events of 9/11 to constrain liberties and expand government in unprecedented ways. Generally, I think our government has done far worse things than the alleged events of 9/11, and I think that there's plenty of evidence to support that. That's irrefutable evidence as well. Second, I have a degree in mechanical engineering, and I was a commercial aircraft designer for 6 years out of college. I've done a lot of experiments and analyzed even more experiments. But with that said, I've been a software engineer for the last 20 years, so take what I say with a grain of salt. Now to speak to the video. The authors of the video performed some experiments which focused on a simple premise. It was that the upper portion of the building, which was small relative to the lower portion, which was larger, couldn't have crushed the lower portion of the building as it fell. To illustrate this, they performed some experiments, the first of which had a column of ice about 2 inches in diameter. The upper piece of ice was about 3 or 4 inches tall, and then the lower piece was 7 feet tall. And they had the piece of ice in a tube so that they could raise it and drop it. And as they would raise the piece of ice, the upper piece of ice, and drop it onto the lower piece, there would be an impact and some shattering of ice at the interface between the two pieces of ice. As you might imagine, the upper piece, after several drops, kept getting crushed, and though it was crushing the upper portion of the lower piece, both of them were disintegrating, and eventually the top piece disappeared, and there was much of the lower piece still remaining. A similar experiment was performed with concrete blocks, raising them up and dropping them onto a column of other concrete blocks. The idea being that the upper portion couldn't have crushed the lower portion. Now, it seemed like a compelling argument that was being made in the video. But after viewing it, I had not only a lot of questions about that particular experiment or the premise that they were trying to prove, but also I saw a number of flaws with the experiments themselves. So let me address several of these. First of all, the small block, large block assumption is invalid when each floor collapsed one at a time. And each of those collapsing floors added to the mass of the object that was falling onto the lower object. That mass would have assisted in crushing the floors below that. Their mass the mass of each floor that was crushed was small compared to the mass that was already falling, and so they wouldn't slow down that mass very much, but they would add to the crushing force. The experiment dropped the smaller block from a height that was several times its own height. So it was raised up a couple of feet and then dropped onto the larger block beneath it. This didn't really simulate the actual collapse of the World Trade Center, where the initial drop would have just been one floor, about 10 or 15 feet would be the height of that collapsed initially. As you can imagine, if you think of the block of ice dropping onto the smaller block, or the larger block below it, if it was only dropped from a fraction of its own height, there wouldn't be much crushing and the experiment wouldn't be very exciting to watch. I think what that illustrates is a fatal flaw in the design of the experiment, and that is that they didn't have the proper strength to mass ratio in the experiment. When you think about how a building is designed, it's designed just strong enough with an appropriate safety factor to be able to hold the weight of the structure above it. And when that begins to fall on it, it's easy to overwhelm that design strength. Whereas with a piece of ice, a solid piece of ice, it's pretty strong. There were several other flaws with the experiment. They talked about the acceleration of the roof line and that it too closely approximated free fall. They talked about evidence in the film of dripping molten steel dripping out of the building as if pyrotechnics were melting the structure of the building before it collapsed. Some of the claims in other videos had to do with the fact that they thought that proportion of the building was falling too quickly, or it was approaching free fall. There were several elements, I won't go into all of them, that were problematic in these videos. But as I come to it, my point isn't necessarily to stand in defense of the government or to condemn the people that created this video necessarily, except the point is that experiments like these are very difficult to create in a realistic way. Even scientific experiments, which are done when they're peer-reviewed and designed out with all kinds of parameters, it's often easy to get misleading results. There are currently a lot of unanswered questions about the collapse of the trade centers. Unfortunately, we'll never know the answers to many of those questions. But for some to claim that there's no other explanation than whatever seems a bit presumptuous to me. For now, I'll just have to continue to be a skeptic.